My mother introduced me to the wedding planner as the help on a Thursday afternoon in June 2023, gesturing vaguely in my direction while discussing seating arrangements for my own sister's wedding. 4 months later, in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m., an emergency room physician looked at my mother directly and said the words that finally, permanently changed how my family would ever be able to describe me again. Dr. Whitfield saved your daughter's life tonight. You should know exactly who was in that room. Part 1. The family hierarchy I grew up inside. My name is Adaeze, and I grew up in a household in suburban Maryland, the older of two daughters born to Nigerian immigrant parents who had built, over several decades, a life defined by a very specific, very rigid understanding of which of their children represented the family's genuine success story. My younger sister, Chidinma, 3 years my junior, had been, for as long as either of us could remember, my parents' unambiguous favorite, beautiful in the specific way that drew constant, effusive family comment, socially effortless. The child who never seemed to struggle visibly with anything, who married young, in her mid-20s, to a man from a prominent Nigerian-American family, my parents considered a significant social achievement. I had followed a considerably longer, less visibly glamorous path. I completed my undergraduate degree in biology in 2011, then spent the following decade pursuing medical school, followed by a grueling residency in emergency medicine, followed by 2 additional years of fellowship training in critical care medicine. A path that had, by 2023, made me a board-certified emergency medicine physician working at a major trauma center in Baltimore, but a path that had unfolded, for most of those years, without the kind of visible, easily narrated milestones, no wedding, no children, years spent working overnight shifts that made regular family visits genuinely difficult to sustain, that my family seemed to value and understand. I want to be honest that my family's dismissiveness toward my career had never been entirely conscious or deliberate cruelty. It seemed to stem, instead, from a genuine, long-standing inability to translate the specific shape of my professional life into terms that fit their existing framework for what a daughter's success was supposed to look like. A framework built almost entirely around marriage, visible domestic stability, and social presentation, rather than the considerably less immediately legible achievement of surviving a medical residency and building a career in emergency medicine. Part 2. How the Maid comment happened. Chidinma's wedding, planned for October 2023, had become, over the preceding several months, the organizing focus of my entire family's attention, my mother in particular throwing herself into the planning with an intensity that reflected, I think, genuine excitement about finally hosting the kind of large, socially significant celebration she'd apparently always envisioned for her favored daughter. I had taken considerable time off from my demanding hospital schedule, specifically to help with wedding preparations, flying home to Maryland on multiple occasions throughout that summer to assist with venue visits, catering decisions, and the general logistics that a large wedding requires genuine, substantial help that I offered willingly, out of real love for my sister despite our family's complicated dynamics. It was during one of these planning sessions, in June 2023, meeting with the wedding planner at my parents' house to finalize seating arrangements, that the incident occurred. The wedding planner, a woman named Rebecca, arrived slightly early, encountering me in the kitchen where I was organizing seating chart materials my mother had asked me to help prepare. "And this is?" Rebecca asked, gesturing toward me, once my mother entered the room shortly after. My mother, distracted, focused entirely on the wedding logistics at hand, gave a response I have thought about more times than I can count in the months since. "Oh, that's just the help for today. She's organizing the seating materials for us." I stood there, in my own family's kitchen, having spent the entire summer contributing genuine, substantial labor toward my sister's wedding, described to a stranger as hired help rather than as my mother's own daughter. Part 3. A pattern, not an isolated incident. I want to be honest that I did not immediately confront my mother about this specific comment, partly out of sheer shock in the moment, and partly because, upon reflection over the following days, I recognized it as simply the most explicit, undeniable instance of a considerably longer pattern I had, until that point, mostly absorbed without directly nomming. I began, over the following weeks, cataloging specific memories that reorganized themselves, in retrospect, into a clearer, more troubling pattern than I'd previously allowed myself to fully acknowledge. My mother's tendency to introduce me at family gatherings with vague, minimizing language. She works in medicine, rather than any specific acknowledgement of my actual position and training. Her habit, at extended family events, of directing most conversation and attention toward Chidinma while treating my presence as almost incidental. A particularly telling memory from the previous Christmas, when a distant cousin had asked what I did for work, and my mother had answered on my behalf, before I could speak, with a brief, dismissive, "She's still in school," despite the fact that I had completed my residency training 2 full years earlier and was, by that point, a fully credentialed attending physician. I raised the "help" comment directly with my mother about a week after it occurred, in a conversation that revealed, more than anything else, how genuinely, uncomfortably unexamined this entire pattern remained for her. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, when I brought it up. "I was distracted, thinking about the wedding. It was just a careless thing to say, Adaeze, not some deep statement about how I see you." I wanted to believe that explanation, and in the moment, I mostly let it go, telling myself, as I had for years, that pushing the issue further wasn't worth the conflict it would likely generate during an already stressful wedding planning period. Part 4. The night everything changed. The wedding took place in October 2023, an elaborate, well-attended celebration that unfolded, for the most part, smoothly and joyfully. My complicated feelings about my family's dynamics set carefully aside in favor of genuine happiness for my sister on her actual wedding day. The crisis that would eventually expose the full weight of my family's dismissiveness toward my professional identity occurred roughly 6 weeks later, in late November 2023, when Chidinma, only weeks into her honeymoon period as a newly married woman, was rushed to the emergency room following a severe allergic reaction during a family dinner at my parents' house. A reaction, it would later be determined, triggered by a previously unknown shellfish allergy that manifested with alarming, rapid severity. By pure coincidence, the specific kind of coincidence that, looking back, feels almost too dramatically convenient to have actually happened, though I assure you it did. Chidinma was rushed to the exact trauma center in Baltimore where I worked, arriving during a night when I happened to be on duty, working the overnight emergency medicine shift I'd been assigned that particular week. Part 5. The emergency room. I was called to the trauma bay at approximately 11:40 p.m., alerted to an incoming severe anaphylaxis case, and it was only upon actually seeing the patient being wheeled in, my own sister, her face and throat visibly swollen, struggling audibly to breathe, that I fully registered the surreal, terrifying coincidence of what was happening. I want to be direct about what followed, because the specific clinical details matter for understanding the full weight of what came next. Chidinma's anaphylactic reaction was severe, progressing rapidly toward full airway obstruction, requiring immediate, aggressive intervention, epinephrine administration, careful airway management, and close monitoring during what proved to be a genuinely dangerous, life-threatening several minutes before her condition began to stabilize. I led that resuscitation myself, drawing on years of emergency medicine training and experience, working alongside my trauma team with the specific, focused clarity that emergency physicians develop precisely for moments exactly like this one. A clarity that, I recognize now, allowed me to fully separate, for those critical minutes, the overwhelming personal terror of watching my own sister struggle to breathe from the clinical precision the situation demanded. My parents arrived at the hospital roughly 20 minutes after Chidinma, having been called by her husband once the ambulance departed, and were directed to the emergency department waiting area, where hospital staff informed them that their daughter was being actively treated and that a physician would update them as soon as possible. Part 6. What happened in the corridor. Once Chidinma's condition had genuinely stabilized, airway secure, vital signs improving. The immediate crisis passed, though she would remain under observation for several more hours. I stepped out of the trauma bay to update my parents directly, still in my scrubs, still wearing the specific exhaustion that follows an intense clinical resuscitation. My mother's reaction, upon seeing me emerge from the trauma bay in medical scrubs rather than as a waiting family member, registered first as confusion, then, gradually, as a dawning, visible recognition that something about this entire situation didn't match her existing understanding of who I was. It was at this moment that Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the attending emergency physician overseeing the department that night and my direct supervisor for the shift, approached to check in on the situation, having been briefed on the resuscitation I just led. "Dr. Adaeze," he said, addressing me by my professional title with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to working alongside me. "Excellent work in there. That was about as clean an epinephrine response management as I've seen this year." Then, turning toward my parents, clearly recognizing them as the patient's family based on the hospital's registration information, he continued, "You should know Dr. Whitfield here, your daughter, is one of the most skilled emergency physicians on our team. She led that entire resuscitation herself. Your other daughter is genuinely fortunate she happened to be the physician on duty tonight." I watched my mother's face in that specific moment with an attention I don't think I'll ever fully forget. The particular, visible collision of confusion, shock, and a slowly dawning, horrified recognition of exactly how thoroughly she had misunderstood, or perhaps simply refused to see, who her older daughter had actually become. Part 7, the conversation that followed. My mother did not speak for what felt like a genuinely long moment, standing in that hospital corridor at nearly 2 a.m., processing information that fundamentally reorganized her understanding of a daughter she had, apparently, spent years describing to strangers as still in school, or, on one memorable occasion, as simply the help. "You're an emergency room doctor," she said finally, her voice carrying a strange, disoriented quality I'd never heard from her before. An attending physician, not a resident, not still training. You just led that entire emergency on your own." "Yes, Mom," I said, exhaustion and years of accumulated hurt making my voice considerably flatter than I might have chosen under different circumstances. "I've been an attending physician for 2 years now. I completed my residency in 2021 and my critical care fellowship this past summer. This is what I actually do, every single week, and I've been doing it for years while you've been telling relatives I'm still in school." My father, standing beside her, seemed similarly stunned, though his reaction carried less of my mother's visible disorientation and more of a quieter, more immediate shame. "Adaeze," he said, "I don't think either of us fully understood what your work actually involved. We knew you were in medicine, generally, but I don't think we ever asked enough specific questions to understand what that actually meant, day to day." "You never asked," I said, "because Chidinma's wedding, Chidinma's marriage, Chidinma's entire visible life always felt like the version of success you actually understood and valued. My path never fit that template as easily, so you stopped asking questions about it years ago, and I stopped offering details because it started to feel like nobody in this family was actually interested in the answer." Part 8, the weeks that followed. The immediate aftermath of that hospital corridor conversation unfolded, in the following weeks, into a genuinely difficult, extended family reckoning. Not a single, clean resolution, but a slow, uncomfortable process of my parents actually confronting, for what felt like the first time, the specific pattern of dismissiveness they'd maintained toward my career and identity for years. My mother, in particular, struggled visibly with the full weight of the help comment once its significance had been thrown into such stark relief by the circumstances of Chidinma's medical emergency. She called me directly about 10 days after the incident, in a conversation considerably more vulnerable than our earlier exchange in the hospital corridor. "I've been thinking about this constantly," she told me. "I keep replaying that comment to the wedding planner, and I don't have a good explanation for it, Adaeze, beyond admitting something uncomfortable about myself. That I had built such a specific, narrow idea of what your sister's life, represented as success, that I genuinely stopped seeing your actual accomplishments clearly, even when they were considerably more impressive, by almost any objective measure, than anything either of your father or I have accomplished ourselves. I appreciated the honesty of that admission, even as I made clear, in that same conversation, that a single moment of clarity, however genuine, didn't automatically repair years of accumulated dismissiveness. I need this to actually change, Mom, I told her. Not just for a few weeks after a dramatic hospital scene made it impossible to keep ignoring. I need you to actually ask real questions about my work, introduce me accurately to people, stop defaulting to whatever vague, minimizing description feels comfortable, because my actual life doesn't fit your existing template. Part 9, Chidinma's Own Reckoning. I want to include here a significant conversation I had with Chidinma herself, once she had fully recovered from her medical emergency, because her own perspective added an important dimension to this entire family reckoning that I hadn't fully anticipated. I feel like I need to apologize too, she told me, during a visit several weeks after her hospital stay. I've watched Mom and Dad treat you this way for years, Adaeze, and I never pushed back nearly hard enough. I think some part of me got comfortable being the daughter who fit the template easily, and I never fully examined how much that comfort came at your expense. I don't think you owe me the same apology Mom and Dad do, I told her honestly. You didn't create the pattern, but I appreciate you actually nomming it rather than just quietly benefiting from it, which is what's happened for most of the past decade. Chidinma has, in the months since, made genuine, consistent efforts to correct the pattern in small but meaningful ways, introducing me accurately and with specific pride at subsequent family gatherings, actively asking detailed, genuinely curious questions about my work rather than the vague, disinterested acknowledgement that had characterized most of our family's previous engagement with my career. Epilogue. It has been just over a year since that November night in the emergency room, and my relationship with my parents, while still genuinely imperfect, has shifted into something considerably more honest than what existed before Dr. Whitfield's unplanned, entirely accidental introduction finally forced a reckoning my family had apparently needed for years, but had never organically arrived at on its own. My mother now introduces me, at family gatherings and to family friends, with specific, accurate pride. My daughter, Dr. Adaeze, an emergency medicine physician at one of the major trauma centers in Baltimore. Language considerably different from the vague, minimizing descriptions that characterized years of previous introductions, though I recognize, and try to hold with appropriate grace, that this change was catalyzed by a dramatic medical emergency rather than the kind of organic, sustained curiosity I might have hoped for under less extreme circumstances. I think, often, about the specific, strange mechanism through which this particular reckoning finally arrived. Not through any confrontation I orchestrated myself, not through years of quietly accumulated hurt, finally boiling over into a planned conversation, but through the genuine coincidence of my own sister's medical emergency happening to occur on a night I was working, in the exact hospital where I'd built a career my family had, for years, somehow managed not to fully see. I don't know if my family would have ever arrived at genuine, accurate understanding of who I'd actually become without that specific, dramatic hospital corridor moment forcing the issue. I'm grateful, in a complicated way, that the moment ultimately produced Chidinma's full recovery alongside a family reckoning I'd needed for years, but had never quite found the right circumstances to force myself. But I also recognize, clearly, exactly how much clearer, less costly recognition might have looked, had my family simply asked genuine questions about my life a decade earlier, rather than requiring an actual medical emergency to finally, unmistakably see me. At the end,